Okay, so in Chapter 1, Section 1, we're going to learn what exactly Ruby on Rails is and what it's used for. So Ruby on Rails, which I'll be referring to as Rails, it's an open source framework for building powerful web applications. And it is not a programming language. Rails is not a programming language. It's a structure, it's a framework to build web apps using the Ruby programming language. Ruby is the actual language, not Ruby on Rails. Rails was created in 2004 by David Heinemeier Hansson, or he's also known as DHH among geeks. And he created Ruby on Rails in 2004, and the Ruby language was created in 1993. So Rails came about 10 years later. As I said, it's based on the Ruby language. Rails can work with multiple types of servers and databases. It can run on, it has its own server called WebBrick, but it can also run on Apache and other servers as well. And as far as databases, it comes with SQLite 3 as a default, which is not it's a serverless database. But it can also be used with MySQL and Postgre databases as well. Rails is based on the MVC design pattern, which is Model View Controller, and you're going to hear that a lot throughout this series. It's one of the most popular and best, in my opinion, design patterns available. What it does is basically separates what the user sees, the HTML and the presentation, separates that from the controllers, the routing system, and also the business logic, which is in the model, which is usually consists of database queries. So Rails it's different from other web app frameworks in a couple different ways. One way is it claims that it's the right way to develop web apps. Many of the hardcore Rails developers wouldn't consider another way of developing as far as the actual structure and framework of the application. And there's a popular phrase in the Rails community which is convention over configuration. And what this essentially means is that Rails tries to reduce the amount of work for developers, and it does this by having a strict set of naming conventions. As far as structure, as far as folder names and class names, there's a really strict convention on naming, and it lets Rails be simple without losing its flexibility and having customized applications. There's a lot of other frameworks out there that utilize several configuration files with a ton of settings and controls. So that would be a configuration-based system framework. They provide settings that are specific to each separate project. And this could be anything from mapping URLs to database and class structure. Rails really focuses on the naming convention over the configuration. So there's less work to do. There's less customized work to do, but you can still have customization, if that makes any sense. Another popular phrase is "don't repeat yourself," or DRY, and that essentially means what it says. It suggests that writing the same code over and over multiple times is not productive, and Rails was created for productivity, if anything else. So that's a big thing in Rails, is not to repeat yourself. Rails runs independent of the web server. Like I said, you can run Rails on multiple types of servers, Apache. It actually includes its own web server, which is called WebBrick. So you can run a local Rails server on any computer, and you don't need to have WAMP or anything like that. It just runs right on your machine. It's very cool. And the last thing is, Rails looks at everything as an object. It's very, very object orientated. Anything from strings to actual numbers are actually objects. You can call methods on a number. For instance, there's a times method, so you can have 7 dot times, and that will run whatever phrase or string you put in 7 times. So it's very, very object orientated, but you can also create procedural types of apps as well. So it's very flexible. So as you probably know, Ruby is the programming language that Ruby on Rails runs. It's like a tongue twister. And if you don't know Ruby, if you don't know anything of Ruby at all, you don't really have to worry, because Ruby is a very easy language to learn. But what you should have a basic idea of is just programming in general. A lot of people learn Rails and they don't know any Ruby at all, and that's fine. You can get by. You just need to really understand stuff like variables, functions, or methods, conditionals, if statements, stuff like that. Just basic programming stuff. You don't need to know a lot. And we'll actually chapter 2 is all about Ruby, so we'll actually be learning some of the language and some of the just basic programming principles. So don't worry about that if you don't know any Ruby. Windows and Linux. A lot of Rails developers will not work on Windows just because Ruby and Ruby on Rails initially ran on Linux, and it used to be a lot easier to run Rails on Linux than Windows. But there has been a lot of developers that are now using Rails on Windows due to these new kits that are available. And one of the kits is this Windows Rails installer, and you need a lot to run Ruby on Rails. You need SQLite, you need Ruby gems. There's a lot of stuff you need, and this Rails installer software actually lets us install it on any Windows machine extremely easy. It's very, very easy. It's just basically just like installing any software on your Windows machine. You go through the installer, and then it gives you an actual command line to use. You can do Git, you can do pretty much anything you could do in Linux. So Windows is definitely more developers are starting to use Windows. And in this particular series, we will be focusing on Windows, but we will also dabble in Linux as well. I'm going to show you how to install it on Linux Ubuntu, and I'm actually going to show I have an optional video of installing Ubuntu, installing Linux Ubuntu onto a virtual machine using VMware. You don't have to do that. I just thought that I'd throw it in because I was doing I had to have somehow to show you the installation on Linux, so I just recorded the VM installing Linux itself. So you can do that as well if you want to mess around in Linux. And the other piece of software we'll be using is Interactive Ruby, which is a program for Windows that will allow us to type Ruby right in the command line, just as if it was a Linux machine with Ruby installed. Ruby Gems is a package manager for Ruby on Rails. It's basically just little pieces of code that you can plug into your Ruby on Rails site. Rails itself is actually a gem. Once you have Ruby Gems, you can use the syntax with gem install whatever the name of the gem. They can be looked at kind of as modules or plugins, something like that, and they are used to distribute Ruby-based programs and libraries, so just chunks of code that you can utilize in your app. It's used as a tool to manage installation of gems, so just like the syntax, you can gem uninstall, install, whatever. And Ruby Gems is part of the standard library from Ruby 1.9 on, and we will be using Ruby 1.9.3. And Rails is a gem itself. You can actually install Rails through Ruby Gems. So that's it. That's just the basics of Rails and Ruby on Rails. So now we can get into some programming. So next up we have the installation of Ruby and Ruby on Rails on both Linux and Windows. So let's move on.